There are a lot of pending issues between Japan and South Korea. And if there is a constant in and out of American forces, they can undermine strategic stability and effective deterrence against North Korea. He wanted to maintain alliance with the United States, but on the other hand, he wanted to pursue strategic cooperative partnership with China. South Korea is sandwiched between the strategic rivalry between Beijing and Washington. This area is getting into the new Cold War in a security architecture. South Korea and Japan should work together to prevent that kind of malfunctioning of global and regional order and try to work together to restore old harmonious order.
Joining us here today is Dr. Moon Chung-in. Dr. Moon is a professor emeritus at Yonsei University and an executive advisor to the Korea Peace Forum. Over the course of his career, Dr. Moon has served as a special advisor to 3 separate presidents in South Korea, starting with President Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, and more recently, Moon Jae-in. He is also the editor-in-chief of Global Asia. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Moon.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
As always, there's a lot going on in East Asia. Just 2 days ago, on August 23rd, President Lee Jae-myung of South Korea visited Japan and met with Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba. I just want to hear your overall assessment of how the meeting went.
I think it went very well, and what the Japanese media call it, a very pleasant surprise, because it was very unprecedented that the South Korean president visit Tokyo ahead of his visit to Washington.
Right.
And also, there are a lot of pending issues between Japan and South Korea. Despite those pending issues, President Lee Jae-myung decided to visit Tokyo first and have a meeting with Prime Minister Ishiba, and that's another significant aspect. More importantly, whenever there is a political turmoil in Japan, South Korean president used to avoid visiting Japan. But despite the political uncertainty in Japan, he decided to visit to Tokyo, and I think that's very significant. Most importantly, President Lee Jae-myung didn't mention about past history.
Right.
Okay? And that is very unusual. There will be some domestic political repercussion after he returned to Seoul. However, he emphasized that we should look toward the future. Okay, and of course he'll be raising the historical issues perhaps later, but not now.
Right.
For him, most important thing is to resuscitate or normalize bilateral relations with Japan in a very constructive manner. Therefore, in the sense, his visit to Tokyo was very, very successful, and he was very well received by Prime Minister Ishiba, and their meeting was very, very congenial, and I think that really signals a very good starting point for those 2 leaders.
Right, right. So how do you see the relationship sort of evolving from here onwards?
Both leaders have agreed to resume the shuttle diplomacy, and that was stopped for the time being. Therefore, once 2 leaders began to initiate the shuttle diplomacy, and I think the consultation between the 2 countries will be much more routine, and so that they can resolve a lot of differences between the 2 countries. Therefore, I think that there is very positive development.
Okay. And President Lee Jae-myung's next stop is, of course, the United States, and I believe he's already in Washington at this point, and will soon be meeting President Donald Trump for a bilateral summit. What are some of the main agendas, issues, do you think, that will be discussed between the 2? And do you think President Lee and his team is ready to negotiate these top issues?
I think there will be 3 major agenda. First agenda, particularly on the part of President Trump, will be tariff and investment, because South Korea has committed to contribute about $350 billion investment fund in the United States. Okay, but South Korea thinks that that investment fund will be the form of loans and loan guarantees.
Right.
But President Trump thinks in a different way. He thinks that it will be just outright cash contribution to create the investment fund.
Right.
Therefore, there is a huge difference between the U.S. and South Korea on the composition of the investment fund and how it is going to be used. That is the same between Tokyo and Washington.
Right.
For that issue will be the one major issue. Another issue will be issue of modernization of allocate U.S. alliance. United States seems to have three major issues related to the modernization of allocate U.S. Alliance. The first is the issue of increasing defense cost sharing and also increasing defense burden sharing. Defense cost sharing means what? We are now covering about $1 billion for defense costs related to American troops in South Korea. But President Trump wants us to increase to $10 billion.
Right.
It will be unacceptable to South Korea. Therefore, that will be one big issue. Another issue, as with the NATO members and Japan, President Trump will be asking South Korea to increase its defense budget to 5% of GDP. Okay, that will be very, very burdensome to South Korea. That will be another contentious point. That is one item. Another item is related to the issue of strategic flexibility of American forces in South Korea. In light of Chinese rise in the region, the U.S. wanted to pursue policy of encirclement and containment of China through the Indo-Pacific strategy. And U.S. wants South Korea to deeply involved in this Indo-Pacific strategy.
Right.
Okay. In that context, the United States wanted to in and out of its forces from South Korea anytime as it sees fit. Okay? But for us, American forces in South Korea is designed for the deterrence against North Korea.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And if there is a constant in and out of American forces, they can undermine strategic stability and effective deterrence against North Korea. Therefore, that is our concern. Therefore, that will be another big issue. Okay.
I see.
And third issue will be the U.S. wants South Korea to be more participating in its collective defense in the region,
Right.
particularly vis-a-vis China. Okay. Therefore, the U.S. wants the South Korea to make a more contribution to American defense of Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, etc. But the South Koreans have been arguing that we have imminent threat coming from North Korea. Therefore, we cannot divert our forces to Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. That is another issue.
Right.
But third issue will be most likely to be raised by President Lee Jae-myung. Lee Jae-myung will be asking President Trump to take more initiative in resuscitating U.S. DPRK talks on denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, there will be three major issues between President Trump and President Lee Jae-myung in Washington, D.C.
So a lot of tough negotiations ahead. I want to turn our attention to China for a moment. As you know, part of the Trump administration's policy is to encircle China. And of course, Trump administration is ramping up pressure against South Korea and Japan to do more in terms of containing China. I do want to ask, and under the former Yoon Suk-yeol administration, the relationship between Seoul and Beijing deteriorated quite a bit. How do you think the new government in South Korea would try to revive its relationship with China and to sort of address the ramping up pressure from Washington?
No, President Lee Jae-myung made it very clear that the foundation of his foreign policy will be based on the ROK-US alliance and ROK-Japan-US trilateral cooperation. However, he does not want to isolate or make China isolated, from South Korea foreign policy. Therefore, on the one hand, he wanted to maintain alliance with the United States, but on the other hand, he wanted to pursue strategic cooperative partnership with China. Okay, maybe the U.S. will be putting pressure on him to get away from China, by joining Indo-Pacific strategy most actively, and also by joining de-risking strategy more actively. However, President Lee Jae-myung will be trying to pursue more balanced approach, in combining alliance with the U.S. as well as strategic cooperative partnership with China. Therefore, his position is very clear. He wanted to have a good relations with China, Russia, even North Korea.
Right.
Because for him, it is bad idea to have a hostile relations with neighboring countries, because that will be our security burden. Therefore, he wanted to get away from that, burden. That is the so-called essence of his pragmatic, foreign policy.
Do you see the possibility with this increased pressure from Washington towards its allies in East Asia that South Korea and Japan might tilt toward Beijing, closer toward Beijing, or try to form a separate sort of partnerships that excludes the United States in the near future?
Yeah, there is a growing voices in Japan and South Korea that if we maintain alliance with the United States, when and if there is a continuing benefit coming from the alliance with the United States. If alliance with the United States becomes burdensome on us, if the United States become predatory, then what is the raison d'etre of having alliance with the United States? Therefore, if the United States put too much pressure on Japan and South Korea, there will be a tendency for Japan and South Korea to come up with a new security architecture and new economic cooperative framework in the region. And that will definitely lead to stronger cooperation among Japan, South Korea, and China. But it's all up to the United States. But if you go back to history, for example, let us go to early 1970s when President Richard Nixon adopted the Nixon Doctrine and began to think about reducing and withdrawing American forces from Japan and South Korea. That is so-called the policy of abandonment by the United States. And there was a very close cooperation between Japan and South Korea. Prime Minister Fukuda Takeo and Park Chung-hee, they cooperate very closely. Therefore, whenever there is a sign of abandonment by the U.S., that will foster close cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo. And also when there is a tendency of entrapment by the United States. And then again, there will be a close cooperation between Tokyo and Seoul. Therefore, it is up to the U.S. Therefore, it is very interesting. I read a very interesting interview by Nikkei with Yachi Shotaro, former Vice Foreign Minister. And he argues that Japan should have a more strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the United States. And I think same for South Korea. Both Japan and South Korea should have a more strategic autonomy and more constructive consultation between two countries to deal with increasingly unpredictable foreign policy of the United States.
I also want to talk a little bit about North Korea. There's obviously a growing concern with this burgeoning relationship between Pyongyang and Moscow. And there are also reports that advanced military technologies have already perhaps been transferred from Russia to North Korea. So what's your assessment of this particular development? And I also want to ask, how should Tokyo, Seoul, and Washington re-engage with the Kim Jong-un regime?
That's a very worrisome development. Russia and DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, adopted a new treaty last year. And if you look at Article 4 of the new treaty, now Russia and DPRK have become de facto allies. If there are foreign invasion in both countries. And there is a virtually automatic involvement of mutual forces
Right.
to defend each other. Therefore, that is worrisome development. Okay. But as for the transfer of critical military technology to North Korea, I do not see any concrete evidences that show that Russia transferred those critical technology to North Korea.
Okay.
It is very well known that North Korea is interested in acquiring such critical technologies as ICBM re-entry technology,
Right.
and also multiple warhead, multiple nuclear warhead related technology, and hypersupersonic missile technology, military satellite technology, and nuclear submarine related technology, and etc. But I don't see any concrete evidence that Russia has transferred those critical technology to North Korea.
Okay.
But North Korea will be trying to acquire those kinds of technology from Russia.
Right.
But South Korea and Japan should work together to prevent that kinds of transfer. Otherwise, if North Korea acquire those kinds of technology, that will lead to the, greater strategic instability in Northeast Asia,
Right.
which Japan and South Korea do not want to see. Okay, therefore, Japan and South Korea should work together to persuade Russia not to transport technology. At the same time, we should reduce tension on the Korean Peninsula,
Right.
so that North Korea may not try to acquire that kinds of technology. Therefore, we need the double strategy, therefore, dual strategy. On the one hand, we should work with Russia. On the other hand, also, we should work with North Korea in such a way that we can reduce tension and we can re-engage with North Korea and have a dialogue with North Korea.
Right. Just one last question for you, Dr. Moon. What do you think would define South Korea's foreign policy in the coming years?
It will be very tough. Okay? North Korea has declared that South Korea is no longer partner for unification.
Right.
Okay? And North Korean leader Kim Jong-un defined the inter-Korean relations as two hostile state relations. Therefore, inter-Korean relations will not improve anytime soon. That is one important challenge. Another important challenge is what? Worsening China-U.S. strategic rivalry.
Right.
Okay? In fact, South Korea is sandwiched between the strategic rivalry between Beijing and Washington. Okay? A third issue is this area is getting into the new Cold War security architecture. Okay? And there is a so-called regrouping of the region into the so-called southern axis composed of US, Japan, South Korea, northern axis composed of China, Russia, and North Korea. Therefore, if there is a reverse of old Cold War structure in the region, that will pose a major security challenge to South Korea. They're facing this kind of triple challenges. South Korea will have a real hard time in navigating its foreign policy. I personally believe that South Korea should pursue more creative foreign policy idea. Therefore, trying to turn this dilemma of a collective defense system into the new security architecture based on multilateral security cooperation, emanating from the collective security system embedded in United Nations Charter. And as to economic issues, our economy cannot prosper under the basis of all this, new economic block system.
Right. Right.
Decoupling, de-risking will minimize our welfare gain. Therefore, South Korean government should actively pursue open regionalism and return to multilateralism. Okay?
Right.
And more than that, and I think the South Korea should work with Japan very closely in such a way to prevent rise of new Cold War system and also rise of a fragmented global economic system. Okay? And South Korea and Japan should work together to prevent that kind of malfunctioning of global and regional order and try to work together to restore old harmonious order.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Moon.
My pleasure.
This was our interview with Dr. Moon Chung-in. Tune in for our next episode.